everybody. I hope you are well for what is a quiet, short week because of the holiday in July, 4th of July coming up this weekend. There is an awful lot going on policy-wise and a lot of conversations that I've had with other legislators on a variety of issues. And some questions that came in from you on some local issues and some national issues. So I'm going to comment on a couple of local issues, local policy related issues, or state, one local, one state, and one federal has that. The local one, there have been some articles recently written about MIRA. So MIRA stands for Materials Innovation and Recycling Authority, which was the waste energy plant that a lot of Northwest Corner towns and some other towns used to send their solid waste to for that used to deal with our solid waste. That plant shuttered back in July of 2022, so several years ago. And since then, we've had both a long story of the unwinding of that authority, that group, and also some really, unfortunately, or accelerated stuff in the last few weeks or months that have brought some challenges along the way. So first of all, the MIRA plant, as I said, shuttered a couple of years ago in 2022. And since then, there's a dissolution authority that is governing the dissolution of the MIRA facility and the authority, which includes the site in South Meadows in Hartford, which is quite contaminated and needs remediation. And among the facilities that they also control is a transfer station in Torrington, which is, since the shuttering of the plant, has been the facility that most of the towns in my district, I believe 7 out of the 9 towns in my district, use to collect the solid waste, which then gets shipped out of state. Now, it didn't used to get shipped out of state, but right now there wasn't any choice. And so, although really I think all the towns in the Northwest Corner are not happy about it, both for environmental reasons and cost reasons, that is what's happening to our solid waste that doesn't, for example, get diverted to for example, organics material that doesn't get composted or in dealt with in some other fashion. So what happened in the last week of such, so there have been a lot of negotiations as MIRA dissolves about that transfer state, that Torrington transfer station, and the towns in the Northwest Corner, and particularly the COG, the Council of Governments, which is our regional authority that includes more than 20 towns in the Northwest Corner, have been working together really constructively to try to create an entity that would make that transfer station work, so that the towns, for the long run, and have it be a public facility so that the towns that make use of it could look for other alternatives to shipping their solid waste out of town. For example, there are new solid waste or expanded solid waste, waste to energy plants coming online that could, I am told, have the capacity to handle the solid waste coming from our area. So with that coming, they were very keen there were a lot of really constructive negotiations about creating a public entity using that Torrington transfer station, and Torrington was very much part of that. A lot of constructive work that went into it. Sort of late in the game, there was a bid from a hauling company to buy that transfer station for north of $3 million, which sort of upended all those negotiations, and there were a lot of questions about how that came about. But then at the very last minute in the budget, and this was the source of some articles recently, there was a provision in the implementer to the budget, which is the policy document that underpins the budget, not just the implementer to the budget, but an amendment to the implementer to the budget that had a lot of provisions in it. But one of them transferred the permit to operate that facility to the COG. Now, we had a lot of conversation afterwards about the regional legislators on both sides of the aisle about who put that in there, because it was really helpful to us. It made it far more possible for us to create a public entity, but none of us did it. And it turns out that it may have been done at the behest of another hauler who also didn't want to have a single hauler controlling the entire marketplace in the Northwest Corner, which is one of the significant concerns of the towns out here, because that would increase costs in both the medium and the long run. But none of the legislators had anything to do with that, and that's an open question how that got in there. Nonetheless, it did get in there, and it made it far more possible for our towns to create a public facility. And this, a couple days ago, a significant deadline passed, and the MIRA is effectively completely dissolved, and the original site has transferred in Hartford, has transferred to a Hartford-based development authority, and the Torrington Transfer Station has passed to the Department of Administrative Services, otherwise known as DIS. And so now conversations are going on between just DIS and the towns in the northwest corner who want to create an entity. And I, based on my conversations with them, there is a lot of widely shared belief that having a public facility to deal with solid waste out here is a good public policy goal. We want to make it sustainable, which means we're going to need to create something that can attract enough tonnage to make it economically feasible and draw other towns into the mix as well. So, but I mean, the conversations have gone really well. There's been a lot of hard work that's gone into it. So this is one of those instances where piece of policy was a little bit maybe questionable about how it came to be, but it definitely achieved a good public policy goal for the northwest corner, and I'm hopeful that the negotiations will help us come up with alternatives for dealing with our solid waste. So that's it for the local trash talk. The state issue that I wanted to mention, there was another article that people asked about, relates to budgeting. And so as we build our budget, the state budget, off of what we call consensus revenues, and several times a year, 3 times a year, the executive branch and the legislative branch project revenues for the next couple years, for the next, the short to medium term, and they get together and they agree on them. Hence the term consensus revenues. And so they agree on projected revenues a couple times a year. And the one that we use to build the actual budget is done in April. And we really, from late April, when those consensus revenues come out, we are exchanging spreadsheets all the time between the legislative branch and the executive branch that balance to the dollar, exactly how much revenue we expect. Because it tells us what kind of policies we can afford to do. There has been an article in the Connecticut Mirror recently about once the legislature crafted a budget, it was signed by the governor, and the legislature left the building, there was an additional $190 million in revenues that were discovered by the executive branch. And because that's happened repeatedly, we have some questions because there is some discretion about how those revenues, so consensus revenues are agreed on in April, and then we get updated. And in fact, the finance committee has to meet often the day we pass the budget or the day before we pass the budget to agree on, to adopt revenues. And those are sometimes updated based on what's happened since April. And that's just the, end of April to the beginning of June. So those few weeks, sometimes things change. We were waiting to see if there would be changes from the executive branch. Didn't get that. So, and it has real impact for us. For example, one of the priorities of the legislature and the finance committee this year was to try to create a permanent child tax credit, which has been a policy priority for many for years. And we did it one time during the pandemic, but we had a really solid proposal for a sustainable, not quite as big as some of the advocates would have wanted, but a permanent child tax credit. And we weren't able to do that because the numbers the executive branch was giving us said we couldn't do what we wanted to. We did craft a smaller piece, and we used what's known as the EITC, which is the now I can't remember. It's an earned income tax credit, which is aimed at a lower income threshold than we had wanted to use for the child tax credit. So it's a smaller group of people who are eligible, but it's the people who most need that tax credit. And we were able to provide them with a $250 per family for those, those who qualify, who have dependents. But it was, that was a subset of what we wanted. And had we known we had another $190 million to work with, we might have done something quite different. So we are working to try to have a better way of making sure that we're working off of accurate numbers in the future. We did something on that this year. We passed legislation that improves what are known as the fiscal accountability reports, which are also done twice a year. Which also they're much more comprehensive. They talk about, the economic projections for our economy and for revenue and all kinds of things. And we gave both the Office of Fiscal Analysis, which is the legislative analytical group, which is the executive branch group, basically permission to use more and better information to make predictions that were actually real world based. So I hope to continue that effort to make sure that we're actually dealing with the same set of information when we're working together to craft a budget. So speaking of budget, the last thing I wanted to touch on, of course, is the federal disaster that just passed the Senate. And I wanted to particularly focus on Medicaid because that's going to have a big impact because Medicaid is funded both federally and by states and has a big impact on our budget and will probably drive us into special session at some point once we put the numbers on that. But I want to just point out that there's been some commentators, those who voted for the budget, talking about Medicaid as if it's, a bunch of guys sitting on the couch in their basement playing video games collecting Medicaid benefits. That's not how Medicaid works. These are healthcare benefits. You're getting Medicaid if you are getting chemotherapy, if your child is having surgery. Medicaid is about the medical care that's provided to you. It's not checks that are being delivered in the mail. So if you are cutting Medicaid, you are cutting services. You are eliminating people's access to actual health care. Some of those restrictions come in the form of requiring people to work, which on paper sounds like a good idea. We should, encourage people to work. But we have conducted an experiment in the past because of the way that the Affordable Care Act works. It gave states the ability to create those kind of work restrictions if they wanted to or not. Some states did, some states didn't. Did those states who created work restrictions increase employment? No, they did not. So it does not increase employment. It just makes it harder for people to get access to benefits, which in turn make them more able to work. So we know that doesn't work. And it is going to be terribly punitive for a lot of people in Connecticut and throughout the country. And I want to note, particularly for rural hospitals, which of course we know a thing or two about, when you decrease Medicaid, a lot of rural hospitals across the country are dependent on Medicaid. And when you decrease access to Medicaid, of course, the hospitals aren't going to get those payments. But what they are going to get is people showing up in the ER because we don't turn people away. We require hospitals to provide emergency services. Who's not a fan, as you can tell. And I want to note one actually really unusual thing about this federal bill that happened this year, which is a little wonky, but it has to do with what's called dynamic scoring. So we talk about this in Connecticut because static scoring, we do this when we project all of the bills that we look at have to be analyzed by our fiscal analysts, and they tell you what they're going to cost and literally how much it will cost the government to enact those policies. We use static scoring. We talk about dynamic scoring because often, particularly in the Finance Committee, a tax credit, for example, that might be costly. We're doing it because we believe it's a good investment in the economy and that it's going to grow the economy and create more jobs, and create wealth in that sense. And so we talk about, how we might be able to provide dynamic scoring that will give it, can be a little bit subjective, but it's more accurate picture of what a particular fiscal policy will create. So they pushed to do dynamic scoring on this bill. Dynamic scoring is even more costly than the static scoring on this bill because of the fact that the dramatic increase, trillions of increase to our deficit increases borrowing costs, both for the government and for, regular citizens, which in turn increases all hosts of other costs. So the dynamic scoring that people have been, the Congress was pushing for actually made the bill even more expensive than it was. So this bill is a disaster. I certainly hope it goes down, but it's going to hurt people in Connecticut and people across the country as well. So switching back to a more positive topic, it is 4th of July weekend coming up. I do believe that patriotism means fighting for your country and for democracy and for the things that you believe in and for your neighbors, make sure that they're cared for. So I hope you have a good weekend. Take care of your pets if they don't like fireworks. Mine definitely is one that does not like loud noises, so we're going to be taking care of her this weekend. Have a great holiday, and I'll see you next week.